We're so glad you were able to join us today. Today we're going to talk about, as part of the webinar series with Amita, special education rights and resources during COVID-19. And we have reviewed and summarized some of the most relevant and recent information from key sources to really bring you the fundamentals, which is what we're going to cover today about rights and resources in special education during this time. So with that, we are going to cover a lot today. We highly encourage you to take notes. If anything strikes you, any red flags come up or terms that you aren't familiar with, write them down. We encourage you to ask. But with that, let's dive in. My name is Sabrina Schaefer. I'm an attorney specializing in special education. I have quite an extensive background in behavioral analysis and psychology, and I work with families, organizations such as Amita, and legislators on special education and special needs policies and rights. So with me today, Ms. Judy Ruffalo. She has been a special education advocate for probably too long, and she probably wouldn't want me to tell you how long. She's also a state certified IEP facilitator, which is really important, and we'll talk about what that means a little bit today. So she is just a wealth of knowledge. And of course, part of the Breaking Autism team, I'd be remiss, Mr. Phil Mills. Many of you might know him. He was a former hearing officer for special education disputes and is an attorney and policy advisor. So let's get started. Today, we're going to cover quite a lot. The idea is to give you at least a high level so you understand what your rights are, and if there are any key concepts or terms that come up for you, that you raise them and at least write them down and find further information. So this by no means will be an end-all, be-all, but at least will give you that fundamental. So some things we're going to cover today. We're going to start with some results and trends that we've recently been finding as it relates to special education right now. We're going to talk about the latest federal guidelines as well as Illinois' special education guidelines and how that applies for some of the folks that might not be in Illinois right now. And then we're going to get really nitty-gritty into some practical steps. What does this mean for upcoming meetings? What are some of your remote options legally? And then what does this mean for something called compensatory education? We'll talk about makeup minutes and extended school year. And then the Amita team has done an amazing job, as well as, Phil and Judy and so many folks with giving you some really, really key resources. We've broken them down and made them very consumable because we know you're busy. So before we get really into everything, thank you, Amita, for putting this together. I know that we are all really struggling. We see this across the board. So thank you to Amita for putting all this together and for how many resources they've made available to families. So let's get started with a sort of State of the Union. Some key legislators reached out to Breaking Autism asking for guidance on how they can better support families and professionals in the special education community. So on the left hand there, you'll see across the board, 9 out of 10 parents are reporting difficulty, pretty significant difficulties with implementing e-learning. And as a former, behavioral analyst, it's so true, right? I did one type of therapy, but couldn't imagine trying to do speech therapy or OT or something like that. Now parents are being required to be a teacher, every type of therapist, plus a parent, plus a provider. So it's quite a lot, and across the board we're seeing that difficulty. And then on the right, you'll see that parents are already noticing regression. Part of this, while seemingly bleak, I recognize that, but part of this is very telling as well that there's, a direction, and part of our focus today and even building out this webinar for you was how do we help avoid or at least mitigate some of that regression. And so that's where those practical tips we're going to touch on today and in just a minute are going to come in. There is some good news, though. There is some good news. Another really interesting revealing statistic that came out of that nationwide study was that about 3/4 are not receiving services. But like I said, there is a silver lining. There is good news. At least a little bit over 1/4 reported that their child is receiving related services. And what that tells us, and you'll see on the right there, those related services that are being received are pretty comprehensive and are very, very important. So it lets us know that, yes, children are receiving OT, they are receiving specialized instruction, they are receiving speech and language services and social work services. Now, these are just the top 4. As I mentioned, we don't have time to go through the entire report, but this should tell you one thing. If your school is saying we're not able to provide that, if you've ever heard Judy and I speak before, you know we will say network, network, network. The more you understand what your community and what the nation is doing, for instance here, the more you know what is available for your child. And you can consider that in perspective or in relation to your child's needs. So it's really important to know that, yes, children are receiving services, and that is something that you can get. And frankly, we understand that regression is real and that this isn't easy. So let's dive in from a global perspective. We're going to start with the Department of Education, because that's really the umbrella that gives us guidance. And as you can see there, first and foremost, you know, the federal guidelines, what came out from the U.S. Department of Education, and we'll talk about that, the specifics in just a minute, is the umbrella. And each state, their guidelines and requirements during this time is going to vary, even slightly from the U.S. Department of Education. I say it, you know, the U.S. Department of Education is more of an umbrella, so they give a high-level guidance, and then each state responds to that within their unique ways. So, for instance, today we're going to cover what Illinois State Board of Education is doing in response and in compliance with the guidelines from the U.S. Department of Ed, but each state is different. So we highly recommend that if you are from out of state, because this is, you know, not everyone is from Illinois on this webinar, we highly recommend and we'll give you those resources that you check them out for your specific state. Regardless of that, though, from a high level, the Department of Education said something that was extremely important. Your rights under the IDEA remain. And if you don't know, there's one of those terms. If you're not sure what the IDEA is, I highly encourage you write that term down. We cannot talk about what it means today. Amita and Breaking Autism did a workshop on special education fundamentals, which is for free up on breakingautism.com, and goes into detail about what that means and what those fundamentals to special ed are. But again, we just don't have the time today to cover that. But in relation to that, it's very important to understand what that means, is that districts then must provide FAPE. And that word must in the law is super important. So you're going to get a little law school 101 here. You're looking for terms that give you direction, right? Definitive. So if a school or a district must do something as opposed to may, it's confirmed. They must do it. There's no ambiguity. So I know that there's been a little talk about, I say little being facetious, some pretty extensive talk about waivers. And we're not going to go into those today because nothing has been determined. If you don't know what I mean by the waivers, from a high level, the COVID-19 Relief Act, or the CARES Act, directed the Secretary of Education to report to Congress about waivers under the IDEA, waiving things like evaluation, IEP reviews, complaints, those timelines. So certain duties that districts have, and would effectively put a pause on that. Obviously, if you go back to number 2, right, Congress wrote these laws, so only Congress can change them, and really should only be allowed to waive those kinds of protections under IDEA and 504. But there is this, you know, talk about the waivers. If you are looking to have a voice on what you should do, the Secretary of Education is still developing those requirements right now. So reach out to your senators, reach out to your House members, reach out to your state legislators. So with that, let's take a look at the Illinois State Board of Education. What is ISB? And of course, what would be special education without an acronym, right? So sometimes when you hear me say ISB or hear other people say ISB, we mean Illinois State Board of Education. What are the fundamentals, core takeaways for families in Illinois and districts? Number 1, districts must, there's our definitive again, conduct remote learning days. That's really important, right? And one of the options is e-learning. So ISB did come out and say that districts must provide students with instruction. That's important because we want to know what, right? The must says instruction, and access to educators through whatever means. And that's a quote, by the way. So it's really important if you're taking notes. Two things: they must provide students with instruction and access to educators through whatever means. And that third one is super, super, super important. Remote instruction must be, two things again, accessible and tailored to the unique needs of the student. That's so important. And if you look up at the chat, and actually at the end here when we talk about resources, you'll see that we have the ISB remote learning requirements that just came out in March. Like I mentioned, they're also in the Q&A. There's some pretty specific guidelines to what that can look like. We highly encourage you look at them if you're in Illinois. But this, if you take nothing out, nothing away from this presentation, these are the core fundamentals to your rights as a parent, as a district in Illinois. So with that framework, let's take a look at what to do.
Can anyone hear me now?
Oh, good. Hey, Judy. Yep, we can hear you.
Hi. Okay. Technology.
Welcome,
Hello,
welcome.
everyone. Yes, thank you. I feel pretty confident that Sabrina covered everything just perfectly, but if I do any repetition, I really do apologize. So I'm sure some of you have IEP meetings coming up, and what are you going to do about them? So our advice is that you attend. You attend remotely. I've been doing a lot of IEP meetings by Zoom in the last week or so, and it really does work. It's not as good as face-to-face, and there's some technical issues just like we had here, but it is effective, and as long as everyone is able to connect either through their phone or whatever, you shouldn't have too many problems. So it's been a great option. Secondly, and we say this a lot, if you don't understand something, you need to ask, and just keep asking until you do understand. Go with your gut. If something just doesn't feel right or doesn't sound right, you need to check into it. I'm sure Sabrina touched on, in talking about the federal, that FAPE is still required. Districts are still responsible, and they're scrambling pretty hard to try and figure out a way to do that. But we want you to know that we've heard some pretty crazy things in the last couple of weeks related to remote learning while COVID-19 is going on. One district is actually creating IEP amendments for every single student. And within that amendment, they're outlining how they will deliver related services, and basically put a signature line on there, and have, within the text of it, they're telling parents either sign this or you're waiving your right to FAPE, which is just crazy because, you can't waive your right to FAPE. It's not, it's a duty of the district, not for the parent to just accept whatever's put out there. I know another district is having parents sign off on certain amount of service minutes. For example, if they email a worksheet for your child for speech, they're also asking parents to initial that counts for 30 minutes of speech therapy or something like that. So, again, if you're asked to do something and it just doesn't make sense to you, you can ask until you get it. You can ask for a new IEP meeting. You can reach out to us. Everyone is kind of feeling their way as we go through this. And then finally, always create that record of collaboration. You want to put your parent input statement in. We're going to talk about parent input statements more in the next webinar, but use email to communicate with the team about what you're trying to do or what you're having difficulty with. You know, I know there's a lot of frustration right now among parents and how difficult this is. It really, really is, especially if you've got more than one child and then you've got more than one child with an IEP and you're working, and it's just a lot. And it's uncharted territory for the districts too. So, you know, what I would say to you is right now, collaborate, work with your district, communicate with them, do what you can to get as much as you can for your child while this is going on. And if you have to fight later, you can fight later, but we really don't know. You know, there's so many unknowns right now. It's not worth stressing about it right now. The harder you work right now to keep your child on track and to be asking questions about assignments and therapies and things like that, you know, the less regression your child is going to experience and the less problem maybe that you will have when this is all over and we're, you know, back into school and able to regroup and all of that. So that's it for that. Let's look at some other remote options, okay? So remote evaluations, and I do see a question up there. What if a child's first IEP and they haven't observed the child yet? So that would fall into the category of an evaluation that can't really be conducted remotely. So I would imagine, you know, timelines are going to be extended on something like that. There are evaluations that can be done with, you know, with the checkoff sheets and answering questions and things like that, usually for things like ADHD, the Connors. So those types of evaluations could continue. One of the companies that publishes the test, they've already come out and said, you know, that it's okay to do some testing remotely, but I think that, you know, we have to be really careful in this area because, you know, if a child can't really engage over the computer, you know, how valid are those test results going to be? So that's something that, you know, isn't going to work out remotely. IQ tests, that's not going to be something that can be done remotely. So I would say, you know, evaluations, if they were in the middle of an evaluation when this happened, depending on what's left to be done, it may not be able to be completed until they can get back face-to-face with your child. It just would depend. I did have an eligibility meeting a couple days ago, late last week, and you know, it went fine. They were able to get everything finished. So then also there's remote facilitated IEPs. So I want to talk about this just for a minute, you guys. This is a free option through the Illinois State Board of Education. You can have a third party facilitate your IEP. I am a state facilitator, so I'm a little bit partial to the process, but if you're feeling uncomfortable about going into your IEP meeting remotely, you can ask the state. You just need to call down to ISB and ask for a facilitated IEP. And what that means is you'll get a third party who will come in and basically run the meeting instead of the district. So it's a great way to ensure that your voice is heard and that it's documented and that it's considered and discussed. We know sometimes as parents, we all feel like maybe we're not being heard at an IEP meeting. And so it's just a process whereby that's kind of ensured for you. So it's a good option. And then remote mediations. ISB is still doing mediations remotely using, I think they're using Zoom as well. So that's an option if you do have a dispute and you just can't seem to get anywhere through the IEP process by having a meeting, you can request a mediation. Just to touch on the questions on the side, I just want to look real quick. We have meeting confirmation for the end of the month. Yeah, you can still do that meeting. Districts, what they'll do is they'll send you a link, and you'll just log in, and everyone from your team will be there on Skype or Zoom. And as far as how to request a facilitated IEP, you can go to the ISB website and just type it into their search bar, facilitation, and you'll see the contact information and the phone number. And we can also post that for you at the end of this. So, okay.
No, Judy, that's a great point. We've been doing, by the way, the IDEA allows for meeting remote. You can, we've been doing remote IEPs for years. You know, if we have a client who's maybe, you know, very, very far away from us or something like that, or we're helping a client and we're trying to save some resources, we might have a remote. And we've also done, by the way, the IDEA also allows for amendments to IEPs remotely. Again, I've been doing that even back in my, you know, behavioral therapy days. We would agree to a change. Maybe you'd, you know, exchange a couple of emails with your team and you would get the amendment. Now remember, now this isn't legal advice, but to you specifically, I got to put in my disclaimer, you should be getting a notice of that change, of course. But to Judy's point, you could absolutely, and I've always been able to have remote IEPs and make changes to your IEP remotely. So excellent, excellent point. So let's talk about makeup minutes and extended school year. We're going to keep going back to it, but you have to hear something 7-11 times to learn it, and it's very important. You know, your rights under the IDEA still remain. So you are still, your child is still covered by the IDEA and has those FAPE protections, assuming they have an IEP. So with that, that means that your child might be entitled to compensatory education. Sometimes that's called comp ed, or sometimes you'll hear compensatory ed. Again, here's my little note. If you don't know that word, if compensatory education isn't a word you've heard, I highly recommend that you go to that fundamentals workshop. The presentation is right on the home screen, but we won't be able to cover that, but that's an important one as well and fairly essential. And we'll talk about, you know, how do you preserve those rights or create that record to justify on that, you know, sort of unique needs of your child to justify compensatory education. So what about ESY? Again, if you have not heard of the term ESY or extended school year, I just had a case come up right now where a mom was asking for summer school because she didn't realize that the technical term in special education was ESY. So there is no shame in not knowing that term. There is more to special education law that we as professionals who study and read this don't know. So back to Judy's main point, I'm going to say it again. Yes, I will. If you don't know something, ask. Write it down if there's a term and ask. Can you help me understand what does this mean? Ask your friends, ask your district. You can reach out to Judy or I, Amita. You've got options and you've got resources. So same with ESY. So let me, again, you know, I can't harp on this enough. I love those directives. All ESY criteria must be considered. And the reason why I say that is because I'm seeing this a lot in these remote IEPs that we're going to and hearing this a lot from families and school districts. This just came up in a recent case. The child was, you know, a few years behind and had an IEP, but the district said that he was not eligible for ESY. And so because they were not seeing any regression or recoupment issues. And so that should be a trigger, by the way, because all ESY criteria must be considered to determine if your child needs extended school year. And in this case, right, our argument was, one, they have to look at the severity of disability, not just if there's regression and recoupment issues. And again, we're not going to get into legal parts of this, but there are several criteria, including mastery, your child's mastery, self-sufficiency and independence. You'll see that comes up in just a minute when we talk about how do you keep these activity logs and how do you keep these records. Successive interruptions, by the way, is one of the criteria. Have you had any successive interruptions to your child's education? That might be a criteria, a consideration. for them being considered eligible for ESY? Probably. I would say probably the most notable one in human history. So keep that in mind. Let's keep the law simple. I always say that, again, if you've seen us present before. So last but not least, probably one of the most important things is keep a detailed record and activity log. That is so important. That is so, so important. So let's talk about what does that mean. Let's break this down into two things. So keeping a record is separate than keeping an activity log. In fact, an activity log is part of your record. So I know you've got a lot on your plate, so let's narrow this down. You know, I like to keep it just down to, you know, a few things. Number one, I want you to keep a record of your questions and your concerns. I will say it again, if you don't understand something, ask. And it's okay to look like the dumbest person in the room. It really is. And if you have a concern, Judy's 100% right. I have seen this across the decades, regardless of whether I was a therapist, a consultant, both for organizations and families, an advocate, and now as an attorney. Parents and families just have an amazing sense about things. So if you have a concern, track it, keep record of it. And the best way to do that is to email. You know, even if you have a phone conversation, I absolutely agree. Now is the time to collaborate. Collaborate now, fight later. But email, hey, thanks for your phone call. I just wanted to follow up and make sure we're all on the same page. Or this is what, you know, here are my notes from our call. Including with your private professionals, by the way, because you want to keep a record of what your child is doing and give some comparison, both from a private and public perspective. So let's talk about the activity log. What makes sense there? Here are the kinds of things that you want to keep track of. And this relates both to, you know, compensatory education, those makeup minutes, ESY, and what's currently appropriate. What is a free and appropriate education for your child based on the situation and their unique needs? So this is the foundation for things that you should be keeping track of. One, the type of work. It was a worksheet provided by the speech path. Two, engagement, understanding. How much did your child understand it? Where they, you know, they look at it for 2 minutes and, you know, they just didn't answer the last 7 questions. Independence, absolutely independence. Progress and regression, anything you're noticing there, absolutely. And then related services minutes. How many minutes are they actually getting? So your child's IEP might say, you know, Timmy is entitled to 60 minutes of speech a week. So keep track of that. Judy just mentioned there was a case we just had recently where the parents were provided a worksheet and asked to sign off on that the child received 30 minutes of speech. Well, the speech provider hadn't, you know, speech path hadn't actually provided any services, right? It was a worksheet. So keeping track of those kinds of things, again, if you don't know, ask. The parent did not sign off on it, of course, right, because it didn't happen, but also looking at special education instructional minutes, so small group, things like that, virtual classrooms, and then red flags. That goes back to just, you know, intuition. If you're noticing red flags, you know, this work is way too easy, way too hard, anything like that. All right, with that, thank you for staying over, everyone. Let's go into some key resources for you.
Okay, so first of all is going to be the Department of Education website. It might be a little bit cumbersome, but really that's where you're going to find the most current information on anything new that's been decided in terms of fulfilling the duties of special education. Also, you know, and probably a little bit easier because they tend to keep things on the front page, is the Illinois State Board of Education website, and that is in the chat. It's isb.net. So that's a great place. I use it all the time to keep up to date on what's going on in the state. And then your school district's website, the state just came out and said to all the school districts in Illinois, if you're not in Illinois, check your own state statutes, but in Illinois, the districts all have to have their remote learning day plan on their website posted. So go check that document out. It's probably going to give you a lot of answers to how the district is planning to work with your student and deliver those related services. Also then, there's the Breaking Autism website, and really there's just so much information there. There are videos, there's information that you can print off, sample letters, things like that. So definitely go there, check it out. There's a lot there to help you kind of navigate this whole thing, even once COVID-19 is over, which I know we are all so anxious for. And then finally, we've got 2 more webinars coming up in this series. April 21st, we're going to be covering how to prepare parental input and why it's so important to do. And then on May 19th, we'll be talking about measurable and meaningful IEP goals. So anything else, Sabrina, that you can think of?
Yeah, you know, we covered a lot. That's why we wanted to keep these short, because we wanted you to take away these fundamentals. You're probably going to have a lot of questions after, and we highly encourage it. Just like we talked about where we started off today, your feedback is the most important feedback. We want to make sure that we are advocating on your behalf when we're working with various legislators. You know, we want to make sure that AMITA has the resources that they, you know, can meet your needs. We want to make sure that we are presenting webinars and information that are most relevant and informational for you. So absolutely, if you have any questions, or we mentioned a resource today and you're not able to find it, give us an email, or you can find us. We just focus on Twitter and Facebook. Sorry, Instagram and Snapchat and all the others. But you can absolutely find us on Twitter and Facebook, or check out our channel. A lot of our workshops, including this one, is going to be up on the YouTube channel and our website, breakingautism.com. So go be prosperous, have a lovely day, and thank you for joining.
Thank you, everyone, and please, you know, stay safe and stay healthy, and thank you for taking the time out.